Thanks for stopping by Big Top Gaming. My name's Brian, and in this video, it's going to be a pilot for tactics discussions surrounding the game Moonstone. So, much like every other gamer who goes to Adepticon, I typically bring back a game or two with me that I wasn't into when I arrived at the convention. This time I tried to play it a little bit more conservatively and was like, I'm going to absorb some games, and whatever sticks to my ribs after I leave, I'll go ahead and look into getting into them. So, as an avid follower of TNG Productions, I had known about Moonstone when it had first come around, but never really got into it. I was always intrigued by the art style, and that's kind of where it stopped. I didn't dive too much more deeply into it. But when I had seen that there was a local-ish following for Moonstone to where I could get some regular games, I decided to dig into the game a little bit more and really went deep into it. And this video is going to be me talking about the Outlanders box, as I'm quite interested in the gnomes right now. I've been playing them quite a bit. So let me know in the comments section if this type of pacing for the video works, or if you want to learn more about Moonstone. There's tons of intros to Moonstone out there and what it is, so I didn't feel like I was equipped any differently than anyone else out there to talk about that. But if people are interested in like my perspective or my type of take on the game, I'd be happy to make something like that. But this kind of discussion is really where a lot of my interest lies, so I wanted to start off the series or the coverage on Moonstone with this type of video. So the Outlander box contains 3 different models for the game Moonstone, and they're all Commonwealth. There's one that sneaks in here that's split faction between Commonwealth and Dominion, but among the 3, they all share the same keyword gnome, but then there's some blended keywords in here. There's rogue, noble, and Norse. So that's kind of the gist of this. Is I believe it's all 3 of them have, well, I know all 3 of them have gnome, and I believe all 3 of them have Norse, but then there's a little bit of variance between the 3 there. The first model we're going to discuss is going to be Joanna, the Nordic princess. She brings the gnome, noble, and Norse keywords, is on a 30mm base with a melee stat of 5, a melee range of 2 inches, an arcane stat of 3, and an evade of 0. So she does get put into, in my opinion at least, the melee specialist category, where she has a high melee stat, and 2-inch range is not extremely common on 30mm base models, so she's got a little bit more extended threat, and the things that her keywords can provide to her can really crank that up. When it comes to her arcane stat, if you're a gnome, like 3 and arcane 3 and evade 0 is kind of like the bog standard. There are some deviations, but it's not uncommon to see this. But I think arcane 3 is kind of like the average for the game, so she can get the things done that she needs to most of the time, as long as she isn't going after someone who has a high evade stat. For her health track, she comes in at 7 hit points and can sport 3 energy as long as she's healthy, but that energy doesn't start falling off until she's taken her 4th damage. And as most gnomes, a lot of her energy is kind of concentrated towards the back end, so she can be extremely effective in the game for a lot longer, like their attrition ability is a little bit higher. She does have some abilities on the front of her card that can help that survivability, so I don't really snicker too much at a 7 hit point stat with the way that her energy is distributed. For her normal passive abilities, we have Glaive, which states if this character deals slicing or piercing melee damage, you increase the damage dealt by +1. And then she has Alskling. This is an ability that reduces all damage this character would suffer by -1 for each other gnome or friendly gnome or animal within 4 inches to a maximum of 3. So these passive abilities, well, at least one of them, really plays into her survivability. So I don't mind so much that her first energy drops off on the 4th health box, because with Alskling, most gnomes want to kind of stay close together. They're a very coordinated type keyword. So she can reduce up to 3 damage with that, making her extremely survivable. And it's not like the damage isn't type locked. So if it's magical, if it's melee, she just reduces it. There's no stopping that. So I think she's extremely survivable in those right situations. But then with the Glaive, giving her an extra damage on piercing or slicing melee damage, there's not a single card in the game other than high guard or low guard that she doesn't increase the damage on. Everything is has either slicing or piercing somehow in it, so she's always doing extra damage. So it really does play into this idea that she really enjoys being in combat because she can get a lot of work done. Moving over to Joanna's arcane abilities, we first come across Pixie Elf Elixir. It costs 2 energy for this ability and can only be done once per turn. It's got a cast value of blue X. This character gains X plus 1 energy. The catastrophe is that this character suffers 3 wounds. The last arcane ability that she has is Revenge of the Forest Friends. This is also a 2 energy cost ability with a range of 18 inches, and the attack is not modified by cover. It has a pink X for the casting value, and the target needs to be within 3 inches of a tree or wooded patch terrain and suffers X magical damage. The catastrophe is that the target gains protection. So for the first time that character would suffer damage, you reduce the damage to null until the end of the turn. So when we look at Joanna's arcane abilities, there's a lot going on here. It really diversifies her kit quite a bit. So with Pixie Elf Elixir, having an arcane stat of 3, as long as it's not being reduced or anything, you're able to hopefully get at bare minimum, if you're getting a blue one, you're getting the energy back, but what you're trying to do here is fish for that extra energy to either make her more effective in melee, that she can spend more energy for these attacks, or if you're coming from your opponent at range and they happen to be around any kind of like forest type terrain, being able to get Revenge of the Forest Friends off twice is a really big deal. It kind of makes you feel a little bit better about her energy capping out at 3 on her health track, because she can just get more. And of course there's other ways to kind of stack energy on her since she's a noble, so you might not even need to use Pixie Elixir. But with her output being so good on either of these abilities, I think that you are almost always wanting to do this every turn unless your opponent has something that kind of messes with it. But the Revenge of the Forest Friends ability is so useful to her, because if she's not in combat yet, or if your opponent's trying to kind of stay away from her, you can make it so that you're going to do something with her anyways. So your opponent she's kind of like this package of, your opponent has to commit to her in one way or another, and if they don't, then she's just kind of allowed to run around and do whatever she wants. I feel like you just can't get away from her being 2-inch melee and having the Norse keyword given what else is available to her. So the catastrophe on Revenge of the Forest Friends is worth mentioning too, because if your opponent's 18 inches away from pretty much anything else in your army or your troop other than a forest piece of terrain, you just don't care if you catastrophe on this. It doesn't do anything negative to her, because if you do this like late game, you like wait for your opponent to get the model out that you want to get out, then you just like say, okay, cool, you're protected until the end of the turn, which is now. So I think that these 2 arcane abilities, along with the rest of her kit, make her an extremely versatile model. Now, when we take a look at her signature move on Sweeping Cut, we see that she upgrades it to an attack called Valkyrie Cyclone. So Sweeping Cut in general is a pretty restrictive. It's like high risk, high reward. Both blocks will cancel it, and then it only does a couple damage on 2 different attacks, but the others it does 0, one with a follow-up on thrust. But with Valkyrie Cyclone, there's really no way to stop the damage from this one, because she will deal 0 on high guard and low guard, but with the glaive ability, she modifies it by +1. So you should typically always be doing damage with this unless your opponent has reductions. It's a fairly safe bet when it comes to damage output, because on high guard we deal 0, falling swing we deal 2, thrust 1, sweeping cut 1, and rising attack 2, and then finally low guard we do 0 damage, and that's before the glaive modifier. So she can do a good amount of reliable damage with this particular upgrade. She also brings an amazing end step effect that states, deal 2 slicing damage to all models within 2 inches that did not participate in this round of melee. This does not count as melee damage. So again, slicing damage, so she can modify that up by +1, and then as long as you're doing some damage, which you should be with Sweeping Cut unless your opponent's kind of teched against it, you should be able to start working on getting rid of some of these like crowding out, distracted pieces. So like I'm having flashbacks to my experience with Boris the Bunny Summoner, where I had 3 of them because I called a lot of bluffs when I shouldn't have. I think I should have, but it is what it is. Anyways, I had 3 bunnies that were crowding out my very not well put together gotch gut. And if Joanna was over there upgrading her sweeping cuts, she would be mowing down these bunnies like nothing. So if your opponent has a very synergistic troop that needs to have like a buddy cop type of situation in melee, they are really de-incentivized from that because Joanna can just upgrade sweeping cut and really start plugging these things down. So I think Valkyrie Cyclone is an amazing ability, and it really ties her kit together in what she wants to do. She really is kind of a jack of all trades. The next model up in discussion is going to be Loki, Nordic Shipwright. He is Commonwealth only and sports the gnome, rogue, and Norse keywords. He comes in on a 30mm base and has a melee stat of 4, a melee range of 1 inch, an arcane stat of 3, and an evade of 0. So he's a little bit over or above average on the melee output, but again, 2-inch melee is rare, so 1 inch isn't like a big hindrance for him here. On the arcane side of things, he's pretty much your standard gnome where you've got your average 3 and an evade 0, so you might have some harder times getting into targets that kind of have that better evade stat. When we get to the passive abilities, we can see that he has the hammer ability that states if this character deals piercing or slicing melee damage, you reduce the damage dealt to null. If this character deals impact melee damage, you increase the damage dealt by +1. So this makes Loki a little bit more finicky to handle in combat as the active player because, like I had stated with Joanna, every card has slicing or piercing damage on it. So you do shut him out of thrust and sweeping cut, which kind of limits him to only playing falling strike and rising attack. Those both have the ability to do quite a bit of damage. They have some spikes on there. So Loki's like a high risk, high reward type melee character. Again, the low guard or high guard doesn't block both on those attacks, so you kind of have a little bit of leeway or some abilities to kind of slip one under your opponent's nose and do quite a bit of damage. He does have the Favor of the Old Gods ability, which states, when this character suffers damage, you may flip the top card of the arcane deck and reduce the damage suffered by -X, where X is the value of the flipped card. Catastrophe reduces the damage suffered by 0. And this happens, you can do this once per turn. So Favor of the Old Gods can make it so that Loki can get up in the business and start doing work without taking a bunch of damage each turn. It means your opponent's just going to have to spend extra resources to start pulling him down. And with that, I should mention his damage track, because he does sport 8 boxes, and all 3 of his energy that he generates is at the very bottom of his health track. So with Favor of the Old Gods and having 5 boxes before you start altering his energy economy, it's very difficult to get through to Loki, or he's going to be doing a lot of work until the very bitter end. And Favor of the Old Gods makes sure that that happens. On that same note, he does have the ability Trickster that states, when this model successfully bluffs, after resolving the effect, you can reveal the bluff and gain +3 energy, and that happens once per turn. So a lot of fairies have this ability, but Loki has a very interesting melee presence. So when you're doing some of his arcane abilities and your opponents they really have to think about whether they want to deal with getting 3 extra energy on Loki, which would mean he would get one of his arcane abilities for free and then still have 4 attacks to follow up with if he hasn't like used the energy on anything else and is just dug in for combat. So I think Trickster, with the hammer and the way that the combat works out, it makes him a very difficult model to play around for your opponent, because you're really getting into their head with some of these bluffing mechanics and the way melee functions. Moving down to Loki's arcane abilities, we can start to see some of the synergies kind of showing themselves within this box here. The first one being Verdant Growth. It costs 2 energy to cast and then has a casting value of green X. You place a 50mm diameter wooded patch within 3x inches and line of sight on open ground. This remains in place until the end of the game. A maximum of 3 wooded patches may be placed by this troop. If a 4th is placed, you must choose and remove a wooded patch you created earlier this game. The catastrophe is the model suffers 2 wounds. So, the thing of course, there's the very blatant synergy that if you bring Joanna with Loki, you can manifest these wooded patches, and 3x inches means that whatever the value of the green card you've played or stated that you've played is, you multiply that by 3, and that's the bubble of the distance you can put this out. And remember that this also plays into his trickster thing, where if you bluff and you just say, oh yeah, I've got a green 2, that means that you're getting a 6-inch bubble, and if your opponent calls you on it and you are bluffing it, or if your opponent just lets it happen in at risk of like allowing you to do this again, they're risking a +3 energy swing on him. So again, the active player's decision tree with Loki is pretty interesting, and it makes your opponent's decision tree much more difficult. He can be a real drain on your opponent's mental resources in the game, with being at risk of putting out a bunch of these wooded patches that Joanna can then attack from. Also, the verdant growth patches can be utilized to really limit your opponent's mobility and protect your models from things. And if you get to a point where you have like 3 of these patches in play, you can really do some nasty things if your opponent's still kind of blocking themselves behind one of them, like they've found a way to maybe hide a Moonstone carrier behind one of these forests. You can flop that 3rd one out, or the 4th one out, and then remove that patch, and now the thing that was protecting them is no longer. So verdant growth just has so many different applications that it might look very straightforward when you put Joanna next to Loki, but there's a ton of extra things you can do with this when you start thinking about what a troop needs and how the game flows and functions with these blocked areas with verdant growth patches. Loki's final arcane ability is One with the Wind. This is 2 energy to cast. It has a range of 8 inches and has a casting value of blue X. You move the target model X plus 1 inches, and then on a catastrophe, this model suffers 2 wounds. So Loki is just like, he's again a multifaceted model in this card, where he's got the ability to control the table, enable Joanna, and then enable every other model in your army by extending their threat. But a thing to be extremely cognizant of is that One with the Wind does not say move target friendly model. You can go ahead and move an opponent's model into threat range with you, and again, this is like Trickster just gets so much more ridiculous and annoying here, where if you do bluff something like moving your opponent into threat range and they just let it happen at risk of letting you do this again, you just get your 3 energy to then move in and start beating on them. Now, if you're moving them into Loki's threat range, there's a good chance that they just have, like, again, it's so interesting, this bluffing mechanic in the game with Trickster and Loki. There's just a lot of really crazy things that can happen with him here. It really just depends on your opponent's mindset and what they value, what they are worried about, and how the table, or how the game's unpacking on the table. And with Loki's catastrophes both being just suffering 2 wounds, it's not a really big deal. You have plenty of ways to heal in this troop or these keywords, and with Favor of the Old Gods and all of his energy being at the bottom of his track, he's not really worried about suffering those 2 wounds if you are trying to bluff. So I think that he's a pretty low risk on these bluffing things, and high reward when you are bluffing to get that 3 energy on him. He's just such a fantastic model that looks really simple at first, but when you start thinking about what he means on the table, it can really be an intense mind game for your opponent to play. So looking at Loki's signature move here, it's going to be an upgrade on Falling Swing called Strong Arm. It is an impact type damage, and the damage dealt here is 0 on High Guard, 1 on Falling Swing, 1 on Thrust, 3 on Sweeping Cut, 3 on Rising Attack, and 2 on Low Guard. Now, the upgrade here from Falling Swing is quite significant in that there's no way to stop the damage. So if your opponent's playing High Guard, since it's dealing impact damage at 0, you're getting +1 for your hammer, so you're actually dealing damage to your opponent. And then everything else is just a straight upgrade up until the bottom 3 categories here. You're going to be doing a ton of damage with Falling Swing, so your opponent really needs to be careful on what they're trying to play. You might even see them playing aggressive cards in response just to try and get Loki dealt with sooner rather than later, because these Falling Swings, especially if you're dropping multipliers on them for critical hits, is quite devastating. Other abilities from this upgraded attack are pretty nasty as well, and that damage from the attack cannot be reduced by passive abilities. So if your opponent's wearing plate armor or whatever, they don't get to reduce this damage at all. So Loki is going to do damage when he strong arms. There's no way to reduce it, at least not that I know of, but my knowledge isn't as vast on this game in terms of what can and can't be done on damage. It also has the end step effect, stating that you can move the enemy model 1 inch away, so you can still get some positioning shenanigans. You don't get to close in with Loki when you do this move, so it's rough if you're wanting to try and stay in a sustained combat situation. You might not want to push the model 1 inch away, but you do have the option of not pushing them. So the upgrade for strong arm on falling swing is just quite brutal with Loki, and he is, again, just like Joanna, an extremely multifaceted character who can really cause your opponent to go through some tough decisions. The final model to talk about in the Outlanders box is going to be the jam-packed Miraday. Miraday is belonging to both the Commonwealth and Dominion faction, is on a 30mm base, and is a gnome and rogue, so we dropped the Norse keyword here. For melee capabilities, we've got a melee stat of 4 and a melee range of 1 inch, so he's a little bit above average on that melee output, and has an arcane stat of 0 and an evade stat of 0, which is fine because Miraday doesn't have any arcane abilities. They're all just things that happen, so he's not too worried about having an arcane stat here. When we get down to his passive abilities, we start off with Dagger. If this character deals piercing melee damage, you increase the damage dealt by +1. So both Rising Attack and Thrust have piercing damage, so he gets that extra output on some of those, and those two are quite reliable damage dealers, so it can turn him into a very reliable, like, pokey machine. Next up, we have Flea-Infested Pelt that reduces all magical and slicing damage suffered by +1. So it means that you kind of suffered by -1, sorry. So you're going to be cutting down Sweeping Cut, Falling Swing if your opponent's choosing Slicing, and then you've got, of course, Rising Attack can be Slicing too. So if your opponent has a character that modifies slicing damage, it might not be bad to send Miraday after them, because he's going to be in a sustained combat with them, doing some extra piercing damage, and then dropping down either magical or slicing damage. Finally, for passive abilities, he has Honor Amongst Thieves, and this states friendly rogues within 6 inches gain +1 arcane stat. So that's a massive bubble in this game. It's roughly a little over 13-inch area of effect that he's got, and for someone who wants to be kind of playing around in your opponent's backfield, it's nice to be able to make sure that if you're trying to support other rogues that you happen to be bringing with you, that he can do that without having to brick up, because these rogues kind of do like to function solo, and he's not an exception to that. But bringing in this this arcane buff is a really big deal for him. I did forget to mention his health track. He's also sporting 8 wounds, and then his arcane is 3, or I mean his energy is 3, but it drops off at his 5th damage taken. So he's, you know, very similar to Joanna, with just a little bit more effectiveness on the amount of energy he can get. So moving on from that, we'll get to his active abilities, the first of which is Sneaking. For 1 energy, this character gains -2 evade stat until end of turn. So if your opponent does happen to be targeting, or is in a position to be targeting Miraday, getting that -2 evade is really helpful for him surviving, especially if they happen to be throwing magical damage at him, because he's harder to actually connect with, and when you do, you're dropping damage down. So Sneaking is an amazing ability that you can just turn on when you need it, and if you don't, then it's just there for when you do, I guess. Next up, we have Squeaking, which is 6-inch range, 1 energy. You move target enemy 1 inch, and then reaction steps cannot be declared in response to this action, because if they were, it would make this ability functionally just an energy sink, and a situational one at that. So Squeaking is a nice enabler for either getting your opponent's models closer to your melee threats, or pulling your opponent's models out of position if they happen to be by a Moonstone or somewhere else where they're trying to set up for being in threat for the next turn or activation. And this isn't restricted to once. So if Miraday just happens to be within like 3 inches of something, he can drop all 3 of his energy to move them 3 inches, and that's just a massive disruption to your opponent's plans. Next up, we have Robbery, which is 2 energy at 1 inch. So you could use squeaking to get your opponent into this. And it triggers, you can only do it once per turn. And then it states that target model with less wounds remaining than this character loses possession of 1 Moonstone, and this character gains possession of that Moonstone. So essentially with robbery, you can, if your opponent's beat down a little bit, or you're just, you've been healing pretty well, you can just spend 2 energy, and if they're 1 inch away, take it away from them. All that hard work that they did to harvest that Moonstone is now yours. And this particular ability is really quite great in that in order to get your opponent to drop Moonstones, you typically have to take them off the board. But with this, you can steal that from them, use squeaking to move them away, and then try and maybe get away yourself with some other shenanigans that are available to the rogue keyword. And then your opponent just has a very difficult time responding to it. And if they do happen to come after Miraday, he can do damage in melee. He can reduce that magic and slicing damage and get a better evade stat if he needs it. It's just really difficult to try and pick this guy out if he's running away with one of your rocks. The final active ability that Miraday brings is a once per game ability called Sewer Rat. It costs 1 energy, and you can only play this ability if Miraday is inside a building. This character is removed from play, and then at the start of the next replenish step, you return this character to play inside any building. So the fun thing about this is that if there are buildings on the table, you can kind of just protect Miraday for a turn, especially if he's stolen a Moonstone. Like, he kind of uses robbery, runs away, and gets into a building and then pops off until the next replenish step. Your opponent really doesn't have any response to that. This is like one of those abilities where I think it's really important to kind of establish a baseline for the amount of terrain and what type of terrain you should put on the table. I'm not saying that every table needs to have 2 buildings so Miraday is functional. It's just like you need to make sure there's something on the table for these types of models to utilize. Otherwise, you're really like not incentivized to bring them. And even though he has a ton of abilities, being shut out from using one ability that's a big one can be really unfortunate for the person who's playing with Miraday in their troop. So Sewer Rat, just a crazy way to jump around the table if you have a couple buildings down. And sometimes when I look at battle reports, I see some people playing with as much as 3 or 4 buildings because they just look really cool. So Miraday could just be a phenomenal powerhouse in that for whipping a Moonstone off of someone and then running into the sewers to try and get away. It's just a phenomenal once per game ability. So for Miraday's signature move, he ends up upgrading Sweeping Cut to an attack called Hamstring. This deals slicing type melee damage, which doesn't really synergize with his ability to increase piercing damage, but with this being a Sweeping Cut, it really alters it quite a bit here. So when we look at what the opponent plays track, every single one of these deals damage except for low guard, and since he doesn't have a way to increase that, it will deal 0 damage. But you're dealing 1 on high guard, 2 on falling swing, 1 on thrust, 1 on sweeping cut, 2 on rising attack, and with 0 on low guard, you're still getting a fairly reliable output on this. And when you look at the abilities that he has that he does increase damage on, or the attacks that he increases damage on, looking at thrust and rising attack, there's low guard is both something you don't want your opponent playing, but with that, they're kind of incentivized to play low guard, so it means you can get thrust in there, and thrust can do quite a bit of damage. It's only doing 2 damage on the low guard, but you're at least getting it in there. And then when your opponent might get keen to that or stop feeling like they want to take damage, they might get away from low guard and just start trying to pick away at Miraday. And if you get that chance to upgrade into Sweeping Cut, your end step effect on this is that if the enemy suffered 1 or more wounds during this round of melee, they gain slow and cannot take step actions or reaction step actions until the end of the turn. And I think that this Hamstring ability plays really well into like the robbery plan with Loki, because you get to take their Moonstone, poke them, if they end up taking the damage, you can upgrade that sweeping cut into this to give them slow, so they're not going to be able to catch up with you. And then they can't even take reaction steps to try and close in and stop you from getting away from them. So I think that Loki in general is just a really interesting model to bring into a gnome army, because they're kind of, as I said, this really like, you know, cohesive brick type army where they want to be supporting each other and getting some of these damage reduction abilities and increases going on. But Miraday can really function in his own universe outside of them and do the things that are harder for gnomes to do, which is get some of those Moonstone carriers who might just be like low level support characters in the back who are like, you know, healing or something, and then Miraday comes around and starts poking them with a knife, takes their Moonstone and runs away with it. And then they're trying to play catch up. You're really kind of splitting and confusing your opponent's forces. And when we use that to take a look at the entirety of the Outlanders box, you can really do a lot of it. It taxes your opponent mentally. I know I said it earlier, but it really does. Miraday is a hard thing to play around. Loki is a hard thing to understand when it's good to call bluffs and when it's not. And with all of that, you have just like this reliable output machine of Joanna. I think that the Outlander box is really great within its own little atmosphere, but also brings a lot to gnomes in general, in terms of trying to get like cool, fun things happening with them that aren't really stereotypical of what you think of when you think of gnomes. Thanks for sticking around to the end of this if you ended up making it. I know the video feels like it's a little bit longer from what I'm used to from some of the other things that I discuss. I had originally thought about breaking this down into like the individual characters to start really talking about synergies, but maybe I can talk about that as like a deep dive in the future. I'm really interested into understanding how best to craft this Moonstone experience in the way that I decide to present information to people. So I'm always interested in hearing people's like comments or suggestions on these things, especially when I'm getting into a new game that has different demands of tactics discussions and things like that. I can think that when the Outlanders box in general is an extremely complicated box, very multifaceted with all of the different things that it can do. So it's not surprising that it went this long, but I'm just interested in people's feedback. This is new territory for me, so I've been doing Ice and Fire and Malifaux stuff for so long that like I'm just in those modes. So happy for feedback and happy to be part of the Moonstone community and looking forward to making more of these in the future.